My name is Deirdre Kelly. I'm currently Deputy Head of the Department of Educational Studies and a professor in that department. I am a white settler, an immigrant to Canada of Irish, French, and Dutch descent. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land where we are gathered is the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Given the precarious moment we are currently living through, I would also like to acknowledge the suffering of dispossessed people around the world who are experiencing many forms of violence. As Dr. Starblanket's work highlights, Indigenous peoples, not only here but around the globe, continue to struggle against colonialism to realize their fundamental right to dignity, freedom, and political self-determination. I want to thank Jennifer D'Souza, not sure where Jennifer is, Holly Kate Collinson-Shield, and other EDST staff for their excellent organizing, support, and welcoming of Dr. Starblanket. And also to Carl Luke for his work publicizing the events and setting up the AV here today. This is the inaugural keynote in our new Critical Issues in Education series. The 24-25 lecture is in memory of Professor Michael Marker. Some of you will remember Michael. The theme of which is anti-racism, indigeneity, and decolonizing. We are honored and delighted to have Dr. Starblanket as our inaugural speaker and visiting scholar in EDST this week. We've kept her very busy. She's been visiting classes and so on, meeting with people individually. I was doing a little reading on the meaning of Starblanket, and Gina can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm quoting from the internet here. Receiving a star blanket brings good dreams, prosperity, and protection. We're honored to receive Dr. Starblanket this week, and certainly we and the entire world could use more good dreams, prosperity, and protection. I'm sure Dr. Starblanket will introduce herself, but I just wanted to highlight a few of her accomplishments. Gina is Associate Professor in the School of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria. She is Cree and Saulteaux and a member of the Starblanket Cree Nation in Treaty 4. Dr. Starblanket studies Indigenous settler political relations with a specific focus on Indigenous politics in the prairies. Welcome. We're just getting started here. The politics of treaty implementation and Indigenous movements towards social and political transformation. She has authored and co-authored important interventions theorizing relational responsibilities to the land, including her book, Storying Violence, which has won awards, subtitled Unraveling Colonial Narratives in the Stanley Trial, and the 5th edition of Visions of the Heart, Issues Involving Indigenous Peoples in Canada. Dr. Starblanket's work on Indigenous resurgence is timely and highly relevant to our department, and I'm sure beyond. For example, in collaboration with the Office of Indigenous Education in our faculty, Ed Studies is on the brink of having a new subspecialization of our EDD, our Doctorate of Educational Leadership and Policy. And the subspecialization is called TSKEL, which means Golden Eagle in, I believe, Stolo. Indigenous Educational Leadership and Resurgence. So I want to highlight that word resurgence because Dr. Starblanket has usefully, through an Indigenous feminist lens, identified 3 dimensions of resurgence that are relevant to TSKEL. First is what she calls the temporal dimension, with which resurgence illuminates present and future theoretical work. I think this is related to TSKEL and the wider EDD doctoral program's grounding in the belief that it's important for participants to engage in scholarly discourse about understanding, critiquing, and improving practice in educational settings. Importantly, viewing current colonial practices in educational settings with what Dr. Starblanket calls a, quote, resurgent, future-oriented politic. Second is the land-based dimension of Indigenous resurgence, which considers land as a source of culture, education, and inspiration. We've already seen Indigenous scholars, not only in our department, but other units in the Faculty of Education and around the university, featuring on the land and community-based research and learning. So the new program hopes to build on that. And the third and final dimension is what Dr. Starblanket calls the everyday nature of acts of resurgence in our relationships. So in the new Tuskegee subspecialization, Indigenous faculty will lead instruction, the curriculum and development, and doctoral student supervision, and they will be supported by Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. So the importance of relationality here will be foregrounded. Again, all of this is guided by the resurgent, future-oriented politic, because Tuskegee aims to build capacity in Indigenous leadership and advance Indigenous self-determination. In her new book, Dr. Starblanket has written about the importance of Indigenous resurgence and relationality. She will be drawing from that book. You can see the cover there on the screen, Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, in her talk today. The talk is entitled Indigenous Feminisms in Relational Worlds. We're looking forward to learning more from Dr. Starblanket about how Indigenous feminists are enacting relational ethics and practices. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Gina Starblanket.
Thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy day to come listen to me, of all people, talk about my Feminisms book. So yes, thank you, I think more generally to start out, to the department for inviting me. I was a little perplexed getting an invitation from an educational studies department, but having joined you, and spent even just a little bit of time, I can see that this is a department that's very, very committed to many of the concepts and ideas that I'm thinking through in this book, many of the political commitments that the resurgence movement is building towards generally. And I have to say I've been deeply, deeply impressed with both the range and depth of ideas that people are working through and aspirations that you have with your own program. So again, thank you for for the invite and for all of the work that's gone into coordinating this, particularly to Andre, to Holly Kate, Jennifer, Deirdre. That name is constantly making a mockery of me. It's really challenging to pronounce, and Hartej, as well as Mona and Claudia for having me in your classes. I too want to acknowledge the territories of the Musqueam people, on whose lands we're gathered today, and as always when in other territories, it's my task to be mindful of how what sort of guest I am as I am present here today and as I undertake this work. And so hopefully this work will bring some benefit to the decolonial aspirations, the sovereignty aspirations of Indigenous people generally, but also those who have ancestral and ongoing relationships with this place. So I'm really delighted to have this space to talk to you about this book, Making Space for Indigenous Feminism. I'm going to just start out today by telling you a bit about how the book came to be. So the Making Space volumes specifically as a sort of set of ideas, but also the specific iteration of the book that I edited. So we'll have a bit of a overview of the book, but also the trajectory of Indigenous feminism, both historically, before moving into why it is that I see Indigenous feminism as relevant on an ongoing basis, and as we move into the sort of future of Indigenous resurgence. So we'll talk a bit about some of the distinguishing qualities of the theory and practice, and what I think is really sort of interesting about this particular juncture that we're at, and why Indigenous feminist analysis continues to be so relevant and needed in the present and, as it would seem, for the foreseeable future. So this is a project that we hear a lot in the title of this talk. I've claimed that I'm going to be talking about relational orientations, relational worlds. And so I thought it fitting to start out by talking about the book itself. It is literally a project that was born of and through relations. And that sort of character of the book, or dimension of the book, is it really expressed in visual form before you even open it. So I have the cover here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the choice of artwork that's on the cover. So this is by Christy Belcour, who's a well-renowned artist. She's actually done all 3 of the covers for the Making Space volume. So for me, continuing to use Belcour's work was kind of a non-option, because I wanted to trace that continuity in terms of the aesthetics that are accompanying the book, but also not just sort of reproduce an identical sentiment that her artwork has had in the previous 2 editions. So, she's designed all of the covers of the Making Space volumes, though the others are set against a much darker backdrop. They're much more representative of Belcour's classical style, which is, sort of black or deep gray backdrop with floral designs in a symmetrical pattern, moving sort of from the midpoint outwards. This image that's featured on the cover here is, as you can see, quite different. It's actually not a new work. It's a very early and very large piece of Belcour's that's actually owned by Professor Joyce Green, who was the editor of the previous 2 editions of this book. For the cover, we had Joyce's artwork photographed, Belcour's artwork that was hung in Joyce's home, photographed, and then we cropped out a segment of it. So it's actually not the complete piece of art, which is one of the things I really loved about it. Indigenous feminist analysis, like any intellectual or activist undertaking, is ongoing and always a work in progress. There's more to the picture than we see here on the cover that we're always working towards gaining a better understanding of from different angles. And through those different sort of angles, we ultimately carve out a fuller image or perspective of the matters we're talking about. So I found this image particularly fitting, as the florals depicted are quite different. They're asymmetrical. And one of the things that's new about this volume in terms of the content is the ways in which contributors are really confronting the limitations and violences of dualisms or binary ways of thinking in our theories and actions. So for me, it was actually fitting that it didn't have a sort of just mirror image or sort of, image where one side parallels the other exactly, but rather, we have florals and plants of different heights, presumably different ages, which, gestures to the diverse positionalities and generations of Indigenous feminists who are included in the book. There's shared roots between the different plants in this image, and we're all grounded in these shared roots, indicating our relatedness and interconnectedness even across difference. And lastly, the junior plants are looking up to the more mature plants as they grow, nourishing one another through those interrelations. So I thought this was particularly fitting for the kind of eclectic bunch of people that I grouped together in this book. It was very much a transitional book, right, where we have some of the older generations of feminists, reflecting back on their histories, their legacies, the work that they've done over their lifetime, with newer generations of feminists who really see Indigenous feminism, live it, and experience it quite differently than the older generation. So this book, too, is a manifestation of that intergenerationality. I inherited responsibility for this book from Professor Joyce Green, who I initially met around 2 decades ago at the University of Regina when I was an undergrad. At the time, I had little interest in feminism or gender studies really altogether. But I enrolled in a Women in Politics course with Professor Green after taking environmental politics with her, and I believe I'd also taken an Aboriginal politics, as it was known at the time. And I found her pedagogy and approach to be quite boundary pushing in terms of the sort of modes of critical thought that she encouraged. which was actually quite uncommon at the university I was at. We talked about indigeneity, we talked about Indigenous politics, mostly in terms of representation and inclusion and things like that, not so much about critical histories of colonialism. It wasn't really till I moved off to grad studies that I started to develop those skills. We maintained a working relationship after I went off to pursue graduate studies, which I wouldn't even have contemplated doing without her encouragement. And I would later contribute a chapter to Making Space 2 while I was completing my own doctoral studies. So I do have a chapter on resurgence. That's the one that Deirdre was quoting from, and where I take up, some of the, at the time, kind of emergent discourse on resurgence. So the first edition of this book was conceptualized following a symposium on Aboriginal feminism in 2002 at the University of Regina. So this was organized by Joyce Green, and it was attended by self-identified Aboriginal feminists and some Indigenous women who were interested in women's issues but did not take the label of feminist. The conceptualization, organization, and execution of the symposium was an exercise in feminist solidarity. And those presentations and discussions impelled the inaugural edition of Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, which would be published in 2007. At that time, there was virtually no explicit writing on Indigenous feminism in Canada, though there was some work critiquing feminist solidarity across racial and colonial lines, and there was some work claiming there was no such thing as Indigenous feminism. In the Indigenous or Native studies and politics areas, there were also groundbreaking accounts, both biographical and activist, as well as a number of works on identity regulation in particular. This work took up two central thematics: Indigenous women's experiences with colonialism and racism, and the identity problematic, policed as it had been by the settler state and then by Indian Act bands and other Indigenous political formations. That literature gap pointed to the invisibility of Indigenous women in feminist movements and in academia, and to the unthinking racism that has enabled some to fail to see Indigenous women in our full historical and contemporary contexts, as contemporary persons living in the context of colonial and gender oppression by the occupying state and populations of, for example, Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia, with their racist mythologies, institutions, and practices. That gap also allowed male-dominated settler governments and equally male-dominated Indigenous governments and lobby groups to say they spoke for women, ignoring women in their politics and in their budgets. Thus, the impetus behind the 2002 symposium for Aboriginal feminism, and then the subsequent inaugural edition of Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, was simply the need to make some space in the academic and popular literature on women and liberation for Indigenous feminist voices. That first edition literally focused on making some space for scholarship on and activism mobilized by Indigenous feminists, and mostly took up the question of whether and why Indigenous scholars and activists might make the determination or not to self-identify as feminist. Those few voices incrementally made space for more work about Indigenous feminism in the form of echoes and new Indigenous feminist articulations. That space produced better analysis of the conditions that affect Indigenous women's lives, and in particular of distinctly gendered experiences of colonialism and attending violence. By the time the second edition came out in 2017, much had changed, and space for Indigenous feminist analysis was increasingly being carved out in Indigenous and non-Indigenous contexts. While anti-feminist sentiment remained intact in many Indigenous communities, an increasing number of scholars and activists were less afraid to take the label or deploy explicitly feminist analyses. Contributors to the second edition examined applications of feminist theory and practice, honing the movement's scope and intervention as a form of social and political critique. There was a growing body of theoretical, analytical, and creative writing relevant to Indigenous feminism, and within the Canadian Academy, Indigenous feminism was beginning to be taken up in disciplines beyond the fields of law, politics, women and gender studies, and Native studies. There was increasing lip service within some Indigenous and non-Indigenous political organizations towards the need for gendered analysis as critical for political legitimacy and for sound policy and strategy, even if action lagged behind. A number of prominent Indigenous scholars also began recognizing the significance of feminist analyses and theories, recognizing them in their own work, and to a degree starting to engage feminism within their own works. By this point, there was also an emergence of critical feminist anti-racist writing that framed Canada as a colonial settler state infused with racist conceptions about Indigenous people and other non-white people. And so here I'm thinking of the work of Sunera Tabani, Rita Damoon, Carol Schick, Shireen Razak, and others. Much important work was also done by non-Indigenous scholars tilling the fields of feminist, anti-racist, and post-colonial theory. A number of Indigenous scholars contributed work that, while not always explicitly or even implicitly feminist, provided important insights for Indigenous and other feminist scholars. So by this point, the scholarly literature was becoming more robust, the theoretical contributions more likely to take up gendered and raced accounts of Indigenous people and of colonialism's distinctive impacts on them. These additional tools have been useful for both scholars and activists. The fear and marginalization that Indigenous feminists felt so keenly because of explicit hostility to the presence and analyses of feminists were somewhat mitigated, though not erased, by 2017. More women took the label, used the analysis, and worked for liberatory objectives consistent with Indigenous feminism. Yet, sexism, misogyny, and racism continued to afflict Indigenous women, and serious engagement with these factors had not yet become consistent or routine in either Indigenous or settler governments and communities. So the second edition illuminated the need for consistent application of the analyses and tools provided by Indigenous feminism, while also providing some first-rate scholarship about matters impacting Indigenous women's lives. 2 decades after the first symposium on Aboriginal feminism, I collaborated with a small number of feminist colleagues from the University of Victoria and the Yellowhead Institute to organize a conference on Indigenous feminisms at the University of Victoria. The purpose of this gathering was to engage a broad, interdisciplinary, community-engaged dialogue, considering how Indigenous feminism has grown as an area of study and practice over the past 2 decades, so since the first symposium, and also to workshop papers that would lead to the development of this 3rd edition. To bring together feminist colleagues today to reflect upon Joyce Green's legacy and also her contributions to this school of study and thought. So now in its 3rd edition, Making Space 3 continues to advance Indigenous feminist theory and activism through new and extended applications of established methods and theories, but also through critical reflection and conversation about the ideas, concepts, and approaches that our movement has relied upon. In their invitations to write for this volume, contributors were asked to contemplate the future horizons of Indigenous feminism as it moves beyond the foundational phase of the movement. Some authors from the 1st and 2nd editions it provided updated chapters with an eye towards new social, legal, and political developments, but new chapters were also solicited from established and emergent voices across a variety of disciplines, so really moving the focus outside of law and politics. Many new additions are from authors who have had the privilege of being trained by the first generations of scholars to call themselves Indigenous feminists, so people like Dr. Green, Mishana Goman, Alex Wilson, Diane Millian, and you definitely see that reflected in their works. So these offer important insights into how these initial tools, methods, and practices have been applied in expansive ways intergenerationally and across disciplines. They also demonstrate the importance of having scholars legitimate topics through their teaching and research. Ongoing invisibility renders discussion difficult. So this edition recognizes the importance of the intellectual genealogy of Indigenous feminism, as well as the importance of tracing change, facilitating ongoing conversations between generations and pushing our horizons forward. It was particularly important to, at this sort of transitional juncture, not to approach difference as a weakness, meant to just criticize or divide, but as a reflection of the diverse ways in which we encounter, respond, and live through different power relations from our own locations. Stylistic, intergenerational, and interdisciplinary differences were approached as generative and as indicative of a diversity of thought and language within the growing feminist movement. While this new edition reflects the fact that the content and form of some existing Indigenous feminist concerns have changed in relation to the political terrain, it also demonstrates that other preoccupations remain intact, indicating a continuity of structures of oppression. We've now had the time to gain the benefit of hindsight with respect to many matters, and this experience allows us to hone our approaches and our analyses. And moving beyond the inaugural phase of Indigenous feminism has opened space for us to engage in greater contemplation of our relationships, which are also changing. There are more alliances between Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists and academics, and with other feminist, queer, and liberatory movements, united by convergences in our goals, analyses, and solidarities. Trans and two-spirit inclusivity is now a significant consideration across feminist spaces, with all feminists being prompted to give closer attention to how they approach and employ the language and category of woman, and many employing more diverse and fluid notions of gender, sexuality, and femme embodiment. The identity and status problematic, while central to Indigenous feminism from its origins, given that it is an effective part of the unending desire of the state to eliminate Indigenous peoples, also now comes with new contours and considerations for today's Indigenous feminists. And here I'll gesture to pretendians and different ways in which identity is posing new problems that many Indigenous feminists and queer studies scholars are taking the lead around. Alongside these changes, certain constants remain. There is still a fundamental hostility towards feminism in many communities, public and political spaces, and universities. Most of the Indigenous women who identify as feminist do remain cautious about claiming the label and explicitly invoking the analysis. And the Canadian feminist movement's coloniality and whiteness continue to attract significant critique in Indigenous academic and community contexts. Specific and structural colonialism, racism, and heteropatriarchy relegate our scholarly and activist contributions to the margins of dominant intellectual and political worlds. So our work continues, as we must still convey, legitimatize, and validate our experience and our analysis relative to both non-Indigenous and Indigenous forms of knowledge production. So continuing to make space in this context means engaging critical questions, and for me specifically, as I took on this task, meant engaging really in-depth critical questions about the theoretical and practical foundations and advances of the movement over the past decades, while recognizing that our own encounters with the movement's central categories and concepts are varied, differently informed, and historically changing. Indeed, making space comprises a continuous project of being in conversation with one another about our shared and our different understandings and contexts, which in turn enable new openings for potentially transformative conversations and relationships within our own movement, but also and beyond, within our own movement and beyond, so also with other movements and actors that we're in relation to and might at times or in some dimensions converge with. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just going over some of the characteristics of Indigenous feminism for those of you that are unfamiliar with the theory and practice, before moving in a little into a bit of an overview of what a couple of the chapters do that I think would be particularly interesting for those in attendance. Well, it focuses particularly on the Canadian context in this book. Indigenous feminism exists wherever states have displaced and subordinated Indigenous peoples. It troubles the imposition and manifestation of racialized and gendered structures of power in colonial and in Indigenous contexts, taking up and informing resistance to colonialism, racism, and sexism. So we know women have been subjected to oppression arising from heteropatriarchy and misogyny in many cultural and political contexts because of power relations in which men dominate and hold cultural, economic, political, and social privilege relative to women. The way this relationship has evolved has not been identical everywhere, but its existence is predominant. And it is in this context that feminist theory and activism emerge, according to specific conditions and envisioned by feminists who seek greater measures of autonomy, dignity, opportunity, respect, inclusion, and agency for women in all our diversity. Feminist theory and empirical work shed a bright light on power relations wherever they occur and foreground women's voices and experiences with heteropatriarchal assumptions and power relations that produce other forms of subordination, such as colonialism, capitalism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. This focus on power relations and oppression also contributes to other politics of resistance, such as ecofeminism and Indigenous ecological positions, both of which focus on protecting the earth and its creatures from the ongoing assault of human activity. It includes the activities of land and water protectors and of what we could call all our relations, all life forms. Indigenous feminism is all of this and more, for it's framed by the realities and histories of Indigenous experience in the context of colonialism, as well as by the sexism, racism, and racially motivated misogyny that infects the settler states' populations and cultures. Indigenous feminists draw on and sometimes critique our own cultural contexts, which also leads to particular insights and objectives. It entails a resurgent, future-oriented politic, as it is a liberatory movement grounded on theoretical foundations. It is premised on rejecting oppression of Indigenous women, Indigenous people, and the lands and waters we hold responsibilities towards. So we find ourselves in the context of colonialism and resistance, the context of personal, collective, structural, and environmental racism and sexism, of genocides, territorial displacements, cultural repression or annihilation, and ongoing economic exploitation. Like other feminisms, Indigenous feminism is a broad and deep category with many different strands, though the parameters sketched in particularly the sort of foundational sections of the book are true for the majority of these strands. It's also unique. The signal distinction between other feminisms and Indigenous feminism lies in our simultaneous preoccupation with land, with histories of land theft and oppression, with the consequent cultural and material losses, and with the denial by the Canadian state or other states, and by some First Nations bands and other Indigenous communities, of our identities. These matters fuel our feminism as much as do the myriad forms of sexist, misogynist, and racist oppression that afflict our lives. So in addition to confronting gendered oppression, Indigenous women's liberation entails liberation from colonialism and the corollary practices of particularly extractivist capitalism, because, as Rauna Kawakanen writes, the exploitation of Indigenous women and their bodies has been inextricably tied to the process of ongoing exploitation and dispossession of Indigenous lands and resources since the first contact. And thus, gender violence is a self-determination issue. An Indigenous feminist analysis commends the withdrawal of settler states from spaces of Indigenous sovereignty and jurisdiction, and the remediation of the violence, deprivation, and dislocation imposed by the state and its corporate clients on Indigenous communities and nations. It challenges the logic of imperialism and recenters Indigenous women within the reclamation of territory, which has been stolen for settlement, state sovereignty, and crown lands, and for capitalist exploitation. These deprivations require reparations for colonial injuries inflicted on specific nations, communities, families, and individuals, and on the land itself. Those injuries are often a consequence of extractive industries supported by the state's legislative and enforcement powers. So Indigenous feminist analysis of colonialism requires confronting both the systemic and specific forms of racialized sexism and misogyny that settler state citizens and institutions project on Indigenous women and girls. And yes, it requires demanding respect, equality, and nonviolence from Indigenous governments and Indigenous men. This includes policy decisions from the former and a consensus on the need for cultural and behavioral changes for some who are frankly appallingly violent, disrespectful, and dominating in their relationships. It includes the need for confronting gendered oppression in contemporary self-government regimes, which deploy gendered practices that create hierarchies and exclusions that negatively affect Indigenous women more than men, and to confront forms of traditionalism deployed to discipline and morally police Indigenous women. So the signal characteristic distinguishing Indigenous feminisms from other feminisms and liberatory theories in Canada to date has been its attention to those impacts of colonialism, racism, sexism, and misogyny, both in private and public life. This is not to deny the other liberatory movements with which Indigenous feminism may ally, but to assert that there is a fundamentally socially constructed, politically imposed power relationship at the core of gender and sex-based oppression that requires analysis and resistance. We deploy gendered, relational, critical analyses of the relationships between men and women, sometimes across more fluid gender categories, between women and male-dominated institutions and practices, and of gendered power in social and political contexts. Feminism, like resurgence and like other critical social movements, is theoretically informed but is also directed at transformative action. It is not an armchair preoccupation. So Indigenous feminism is sort of uniquely situated in the theory And this positionality arises from the multiple forms of oppression that are layered onto Indigenous women. Yet the overarching one remains colonialism. That fundamental reality shapes Indigenous women's experience and that of all Indigenous people. So we contribute to theoretical development by revealing the parameters of gendered, racialized, and colonial relationships, and by being attentive to colonialism as a primary context for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in a way that has historically not been shared by much of non-Indigenous or liberal feminism. Indigenous women do not have the luxury of focusing primarily on gender depression or only on issues of inclusion, access, and equality or representation because that fundamental colonial fact constructs a cascade of other oppressions. The first deprivation of colonialism is the theft of Indigenous land. Much of Indigenous feminist activism and theorizing focuses on the integral relationship between Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, and specific natural environments and territories. Many women are land and water protectors and practitioners of protocols for relationships with our territories. We are scholars who frame these activities as exercises of Indigenous law, of Indigenous title. Our theorizing is for our scholarly interests, but also for our political emancipation and for the liberation of particular nations, communities, and individuals from the imposed strictures of the Canadian state. And increasingly, what we see in this volume is that these theorizations are being extended to interrogate the impacts of colonial and heteronormative modes of thought at interpersonal, everyday levels, pointing to other lived and embodied layers of oppression impacting Indigenous women. To the extent that feminism is theoretically informed, action-oriented, social and political movement, it must in all its manifestations take into account Indigenous liberation in the conditions in which we have been oppressed historically, but also, and importantly, the conditions in which we struggle now. For Indigenous feminists, there is no distinction between our resurgent decolonial objectives and our feminism. Indigenous governance, self-determination, language recovery, land back, jurisdiction, and reparations for colonialism's racist and sexist encounter are essential goals for Indigenous feminists, even if we do not define and experience our struggles identically. We share the broader feminist train of seeking social and economic justice, freedom from male violence, personal autonomy, and measures of social and political equality and opportunity. We're ecologically conscious and activist, concerned with the health and care of all our territories and relatives, not only human ones. We're concerned with the perpetual struggles against national and provincial governments who are always imposing on Indigenous lands and communities and continuing with land theft and their justifications for it. We are concerned with reanimating our relationships with our territories and our relations. We are concerned with our people's viability into the future. Because of this, we insist on the rigorous evaluation of political and other important decisions for their impacts on us, on our territories, and on future generations. So for me, and we get asked a lot, are we still making space? Is this still a kind of relevant juncture or relevant kind of framing of what feminism does and what it's concerned with today? It does remain relevant in the context of ongoing gendered relations of power and cultures infected with masculinist and white supremacist practices and privileges. We are neither in a post-feminist nor a post-colonial order. We have none of us attained our goals, even if we have advanced our struggles. Heteropatriarchy and misogyny, often fused with racism, continue to circumscribe and sometimes obliterate the lives of women, Indigenous women in Canada. Colonialism, the Canadian Constitution, and federal divisions of powers, and the capitalist class that works with government support to secure and develop resources on Indigenous lands are perennial concerns for Indigenous feminists because gender regimes are part of institutional design. In this, sexism writ large works with colonialism as corporations and both orders of Canadian government appropriate Indigenous lands and resources. We are relationally connected to our territories. The misuse, destruction, and appropriation of Indigenous lands is a profound injury to our nations and to the women of those nations. Moreover, male dominance in extractive industries' workforces, combined with their remoteness from other employment options and from women's support and protection services, as well as the gendered, sexist, and often racist ethos in these man camps, creates security liabilities for Indigenous women on our own territories. Indeed, Indigenous feminist scholars in this edition are attentive to the ways in which questions of decolonization and Indigenous self-determination, particularly in the post-TRC era, have shifted the terrain of transformation towards individual Indigenous bodies and largely individual level behaviors, taking attention away from collective responsibilities and relational obligations towards health and wellness. This approach to change elides the importance of Indigenous relationships to land, as well as the need for transformation of the structures of colonialism and cis-heteropatriarchy that now thrive within and outside of Indigenous communities in Canada. So contributors to this current edition, here maybe this is a good time to change my slide. I only have two. This is the final one. And it's just the table of contents for the book. So folks can kind of, ground what I'm talking about in terms of the context that we're facing today in some of these chapter titles. So contributors to this current edition call for forms of justice, accountability, and transformation within our communities that exceed individualistic approaches to healing and wellness. In today's context, progress and nation building are also dependent upon the ability of communities to successfully engage in capitalist economies, further alienating us from our relationships with creation. At the same time, Indigenous women are frequently tasked to a greater extent with undertaking the labor needed for the maintenance of our relational networks, or what I've heard Diane Million talk about as a relational infrastructure, for collective healing and care within our communities. For instance, in this edition, both Hokulani Aikau and Isabel Altamirano Jimenez trace the feminization of land-based work and resurgent activism, calling for attention to the ways in which cis-heteropatriarchy can easily be reproduced within Indigenous resurgent practices, and calling for movement towards equitable production of relational networks and networks of care. Elsewhere in the book, Eva Jewell examines the need for critical analytical approaches to the current terrain of care in Canada, problematizing the sort of care labor that white women have engaged in historically, but also contemporarily. Jewell reminds us that we must remain particularly cautious around approaches to transformation in the post-TRC era, as colonial presumptions of care can become feel-good exercises for settlers that are not necessarily attentive to the liberatory goal of relationality. Indeed, she problematizes settler misinterpretations of relational kinship orders that were common in Indigenous diplomatic practices prior to contact, and cautions against extractivist dynamics among settlers, where Indigenous and women of color feminisms are mined for resources to save care theory from white feminism. And I think her insights can be brought out beyond care theory as well. All the while failing to honor the social and kin contracts or treaties that allow for their presence here. So Jewell calls on settlers to reflect on their daily practice of how they embody, normalize, and contribute to the perpetuation of settler colonial dynamics and logics. It gives space for considering how care can transform rather than reproduce settler colonial logics within care work. So she's really trying to call the sort of care industry to account. Like Aikau and Altamirano Jimenez, Jewell observes how Indigenous women, queer, and feminized people bear the bulk of care labor in Indigenous communities, and demonstrates how care and the social reproduction of Indigenous worlds taken on by femme embodiments can be potentially transformative in bringing forward Indigenous worlds that are attuned to the relational matter of kin. So she's also centering the very real and material contributions that women and femmes are making within Indigenous community context to sort of bring back and restitch those relational networks. Indeed, many of the contributors outline both critical historical accounts that reveal the continuity of logics and structures of oppression across social worlds in Canada, while also further exploring their inner functions and operations in contemporary contexts. Megan Scribe's chapter, for instance, problematizes the gendered nature of Canada's contemporary child welfare system, exposing the entanglement of cis-heteropatriarchy and settler colonialism in child welfare, and more broadly within Canada. So she describes and traces this sort of persistent colonial logic regarding the Indigenous child, but also extends those analyses by looking at girlhood and adolescence and talking about the way that the system, initially sort of imposes a gender-neutral frame, but slowly genders children as they move towards adolescence through the system, and particularly focusing on what those impacts are for Indigenous girls and eventually women and mothers as they make their way through the system. Really tracing out those and plotting out, or charting out rather, the interconnected forms of violence and pathologization that occurs throughout an Indigenous person's lifetime. The more we map these things out, again, the fuller picture we get of these structures of oppression, right, and their continuities over time. Elsewhere in the book, Kara Peacock offers important insight into the psychopolitics of settler colonialism, demonstrating how historical representations of the mad or crazy Indigenous woman have endured throughout history and continue to impose colonial terms, diagnoses, and remedies geared towards healing that overwrite Indigenous women's knowledges and experiences, while also stripping women of agency and humanity and rendering them vulnerable to mistreatment, violence, premature death, and so on. She problematizes the ways in which symptoms of colonial and heteropatriarchal structures of oppression too become individuated onto individual Indigenous bodies and constructed, pathologized as madness. She explains how the transformation of these patterns, though, the restoring of mad Indigenous womanhood, allows us to begin making the world anew by creating new words and stories to understand our mental health and by cultivating communities that can respond with care, support, or even to honor and celebrate our differences. So a lot of these contributors, I'll just say, kind of acknowledge the dual potential of relationality, that in some sort of iterations it can result in the reproduction of logics of domination or asymmetrical power dynamics within communities, but that the relationality, when conceived and thought of in an expansive and non-dominating way, can help us imagine and work towards more relational or more liberatory worlds. Together, all of these authors take up the intricate relation between the personal and political, problematizing matters that are often considered to reside in a social, interpersonal, or individual domain, but also demonstrating how these are paralleled at a broader scale in terms of Indigenous social and political life in context of settler colonialism. Right? They show how a lot of these sort of pathologies at the individual level then get scaled up to diminish the oppression of our capacity for self-government or self-determination, right, for agency as collectives as well. They demonstrate that it's particularly important in an era of reconciliation to attend to the ways that colonial and heteronormative orders and the logics, categories, and concepts that they rely upon have refitted themselves to new social and political contexts, and in many ways have become more pronounced by the current era, producing ongoing and new pressures for Indigenous women and creating conditions that bolster rather than transform male-powered privilege in a variety of contexts. We see this within the discourse on Indigenous masculinities, where Indigenous men are frequently positioned within these sort of perpetual cycles of healing at an individual level, eclipsing the significance of collective or communal orientations to relational accountability. So the need to heal from colonial violence individually should never be contemplated without deep reflection on the interconnected need to transform heteropatriarchal structures that continue to afflict our communities. I'm just going to move on to resurgence here specifically, and why, both within this sort of context of reconciliation and resurgence, it's really important for us to continue cultivating space for critical dialogue about the implications of our words and our actions. But because resurgence or any political movement really can easily be invoked as a sort of overarching collective imperative that it has the potential to legitimatize harmful behavior or insulate behaviors from criticism. And for this reason, we continue to require analytical approaches and practices that allow for critical evaluation of how power operates, not just within colonial contexts outside of Indigenous communities, but also within Indigenous communities, right? Because we're all implicated within these changing social and political terrains. Indigenous feminist analysis has long interrogated how political formations and containers can serve to implicate Indigenous people in harmful ways, and provides important tools to contemplate a return to systems of relational accountability and reciprocity to temper non-interference today. So in this book, we have a number of contributors like Billy Ray Belcour and Kelly Aguirre who trouble the normativity that structures much of Indigenous political thought, and also the normativity expressed in some of the resurgence literature, pushing us towards new forms of decolonial politics and forms of praxis. They explore the ways in which feminist queer analytics and imaginaries can open up new approaches and understandings of love, desire, kinship, and prompt us to think beyond notions of decolonization that center the reproduction of Indigenous bodies, or that rely on traditionalist or essentialist notions of identity and normative assumptions surrounding political action and change. Collectively, chapters point to a politics of the future that is refigurative in that it orients not just an abstract future, but also how we govern or constitute ourselves in the present. And here I'm reminded of Billy Ray Belcour's chapter on the political significance of desire, where he writes about the importance of desire relative to constructions of indigeneity and Indigenous political life. Specifically, he situates queer desire as holding the imaginative power to sculpt new discursive territory that departs from dominant methods and modes of engagement with indigeneity in the academy. Troubling normative conceptions of gender and normative conceptions of indigeneity, along with the coloniality of normative conceptions of the self and the heteropatriarchy of social form, Belcour argues that desire can help unmoor us from narrow concepts and frames around our movements, and thus has important significance to our decolonial movements too. Love, he reminds us, is to feel and be pulled by a world in the making, the world we envision and actively work to bring forward. So desire is a much more capacious and messy concept to think through as a political imperative. It allows for an understanding of Indigenous people as complex beings, and this also kind of harkens to Eve Tuck's work on avoiding damage-centered research. As individuals and parts of collectives, as active agents with the potential to transform our worlds rather than subjects of predetermined and unalterable forms of relationship. These pathways and the conceptions put forward by contributors in this volume are allowing us and pushing us to think about politics and about the social worlds we reside in more nuanced ways. The ways that questions involving identity remain very real, but are now also spilling past existing categories of political identity. They enable us to appreciate that Indigenous people simultaneously carry and embody multiple, sometimes inconsistent or contradictory political objectives and aims. Rigid or mutually exclusive identitarian categories can pose a real threat to relational modes of political thought, as they can reinforce essentialist articulations of who Indigenous people are, rather than who we aspire to be. They can also reify our hardened boundaries around difference. Desire, instead, points us to an analytic, ethos, or politic that Indigenous people intentionally assume in working towards our mutual visions and objectives. So this better situates us to appreciate the interconnectedness and the distinctiveness of our political identities. This approach also helps appreciate our localized and contextually specific political positions, while recognizing that there might be convergences across our political identities and movements. So I won't go too far into this, but I'll just gesture there in terms of thinking through and mapping out convergences to the chapter, or the dialogue that I have with Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard, where we talk about confluences, entanglements, and influences between feminist movements, particularly the Black feminist and Indigenous feminist movement, and where they offer important sort of alternate relational language that can be used in thinking through relationship building that isn't prefigured by whiteness or by the settler state, but that respects the distinctiveness of our worldviews and our political critiques and visions. It is on this terrain that Indigenous feminists are imagining and moving towards the creation of relational worlds while continuing to employ critiques of gendered and sexualized harm and violence in multiple forms and registers. We continue making space for important conversations around Indigenous feminist practices, solidarities, and ethics that exceed commitments of inclusion and representation. We continue calling for accountability and justice among our Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues, peers, and relatives, and remain just as willing to examine our own role in reproducing harmful or extractive logics and power dynamics. Unsurprisingly, this volume will not be the last word on these matters. We have not yet gained our liberation from colonialism, racism, or heteropatriarchy, although we have come some distance from the invisibility of these problematics a few decades ago. There's much room for activists and scholars to continue searching for measures of liberation, accountability, and consolation, while also contributing to the theories and empirical studies on the matters that preoccupy us. So I think I'll just end there. There's a lot more to say about this volume, but we could maybe chat through some of those questions or areas of interest that people would like me to talk more about specifically in the question and answer period. So thank you for listening to all of that.
I have a question about a word that didn't seem to come up very much, but that I really think that your last answer about the individual and collective rights almost not so much substituted for, but helped me think through it. So like, I was thinking about just the intersectionality argument from like the legal scholarship, that there's, Black women who want to represent themselves in court according to a specific kind of harm in the United States, but US civil rights law only allows for a single axis presentation of that harm, and that forces them into choosing whether to be women or to be Black, right? Mm-hmm. In many ways, I think Crenshaw's really clear, and I think that's a really powerful move into that even broader theory as it develops. I wanted to kind of hear more about maybe it's the individual and collective, maybe that's where the kind of, I wanted to see if there an analogy to the single axis critique in Crenshaw and intersectional feminism from primarily Black feminist scholars within Indigenous feminism. My impression, at least, is that like liberal feminism, like Susan Muller-Oken or something, a very much a kind of a moral propositional stance, women are the moral equivalent of men, mm-hmm. or from like a legal stance, the situation of civil rights law in the United States. I wonder if this emerging idea of Indigenous feminism kind of doesn't seem to take sort of that liberal moral move, nor the legal move of Black feminists. And so I'm trying to think about what would be that opening move, and maybe it's a bit more of elaborating of what you were talking about before. But thank you so much for your thoughts. That was really
for sure. Yeah, I think we definitely build. So in the book we talk about the sort of theoretical genealogy, the intellectual genealogy, and absolutely, it builds from intersectional approaches that seek to sort of identify shared, though diverse, experiences of oppression, right, where people are sort of similarly situated. So Indigenous feminism, absolutely builds off of some of those ideas. And I think, you definitely get those sort of stigmas early on when it emerges that, again, that Indigenous women who are sort of espousing some of these concerns have just been sort of co-opted by the white feminist movement, and thus have relinquished their identities as Indigenous folks because they're no longer sort of committed to the cause, the collective orientation or cause, right? So people will be called, well, a variety of sort of labels or names that interrogate or question their cultural connectedness. Oh, they weren't raised in their community. Oh, they weren't raised very culturally. They weren't very, and just to kind of minimize those perspectives, we absolutely see I don't think people sort of readily agree with that, but we see sort of stigmas that try and situate people as identifying primarily, with their commitments as a feminist or their commitments as an Indigenous person. And that, I think, was part of a lot of the early dialogue, in the first edition. A lot of Indigenous women had very principled political positions that were absolutely feminist, but they wouldn't call themselves feminists because of the risks and costs within their own communities. There's still a lot of stigmas within communities, right? And so, you can be the same person, but the sort of vocabularies and approaches that you profess will also result in a very particular sort of depiction of identity. And I think that's something, that Belcourt and some of the other contributors are trying to point us to, is that, Indigenous identity does not have to be this sort of narrow essentialist depiction, right? Either romanticized depiction of the kind of man on the land, or the woman who's, at the birthing the resurgence, right? At the center of culture and her association with creation, thus situates her as this kind of earthly being that's responsible for relationships writ large, right? I think what someone like Belcour is trying to do is to say that subjectivity is capacious and messy and actually can't be contained within those sorts of frames. And it can be contradictory too. Right? We don't have to have these kind of mutually exclusive categories where you're A, B, or C. You can be a little bit of each of those because, like in any political community, there's diverse kind of location. Does that answer the question, or was there anything you were hoping that I could speak to like a little bit more?
No, it's super helpful.
Yeah.
I'm just, for me, I can't get out of my head, since I've seen the title on the slide, a few months ago, Red Pedagogy by Sandy Grande, where feminism is it's prefaced by the word white stream feminism. It's a bit of a put down, a Jordan term even in that text. And so this to me, I don't think that's a particularly constructive engagement with various feminisms. So this was for me very refreshing, given that judgment I make in that text. But I'm trying to now kind of make sense of, and obviously I need to read, but continue making sense of sort of the constructive move that you're clearly making here and the previous one.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who are kind of essentialist traditionalists would sort of say, well, there's no need for feminism. There's articles that are, the F word, or there's no word for feminism in my language, or, there's actually a lot of the early Indigenous feminist works were people sort of repudiating the merits of feminism as it pertained to Indigenous women, and especially the limits of white feminism, right? The ways that sort of colonial logics were reproduced within those movements. And yeah, absolutely, we still see a lot of folks, and some who call themselves feminists. I would call it sort of the literature on Indigenous womanhood. Or femininities, right? The work that's very concerned with recentering Indigenous women and, sort of advancing the argument that, well, because feminism wasn't traditional, because we didn't need it prior to contact, because pre-contact societies were more, egalitarian or matriarchal, there's actually no need for it within Indigenous communities today. Or if we just are effective enough at rebuilding, at the resurgence of those cultural traditions, then so too will come gender equality or a return to those other structures, right? But Indigenous feminists, I think, differentiate, or I distinguish Indigenous feminist work from the work on Indigenous womanhood, even though there's convergences in what both do, right? Both try and center women, both try and revalue women, all of these sorts of things, and hold up women's relational contributions and whatnot. But what distinguishes Indigenous feminism is those who are willing to have conversations that are critical of their own communities today, right? That are cognizant, again, as I mentioned, of the terrain in which we now struggle today, which is marked by heteropatriarchy, right? So we need methods of analysis that are equipped to grapple with those intersecting forms of power. And yeah, I mean, there's things that I think, another big part of this is this sort of turn to relationality, or what I take up as relationality in this book is kind of how we then move as a feminist movement, now that we're not just trying to kind of define the parameters of who we are, what we represent, we're moving beyond that definitional phase where you're still apologizing for your mere presence and explaining why. You're still legitimatizing the fact that this body of work even exists. Well, no, I think those days are starting to move behind us. And what I was interested in is what happens when we employ more expansive notions of who we're in relation to, right? That we maybe let go of some of those hardened boundaries, or, what Rita DeMoon talked about when talking about Joyce Green's early work at the symposium I held. She talked about how feminism, and actually she was building off Jennifer Nash's work on intersectionality. And she talked about how feminism in its origins, Indigenous feminism, really had to assume like an elbows out approach, because you're making space, right, for what you're doing. But what happens once your elbows are down, right? And what can happen once you're inviting more sort of collaborative interrelations with other movements in the name of something like unity, right? Because recognizing the very, distinct character of a movement is great, but it's also kind of isolating, right? It talks about who's in, who's out, who's not an Indigenous feminist. And I, in this book, really tried to do away with or think through the expansion of these kind of narrow identity categories. So where, the early volumes were very concerned with who is or is not a feminist and those sorts of questions, and I think necessarily so when you're establishing a movement. Over time, I have students asking me, well, I'm not Indigenous. Can I be an Indigenous feminist? Well, absolutely. There's ways that you could call it whatever you want, right? Decolonial feminism, anti-imperial feminism, you could call it women of color feminism, but there will be convergences that unite us while also recognizing distinctions and divergences in our movements. And so Belcourt is really helpful in his chapter because he's talking about the ways in which Indigenous feminist work, can have convergences or ally itself with some of the queer studies scholarship, and particularly the creative work that Indigenous queer scholars are doing to kind of point us to new horizons. But he's also saying, here's some of the areas where queer studies misses the mark. Because I'm Indigenous, it is an identitarian politic, right? I'm of a people and I am of a place. So it's also a territorial politic, which will distinguish us from Black feminisms, from other sort of political critiques, and the subject at the center of those critiques, right? So it's important to sort of be able to map that out and to think of those boundaries or those identity categories as perhaps a bit more permeable. The Indigenous feminist movement could grow if it also includes, people who ally themselves with decolonial feminism, with anti-imperialist or anti-racist feminism, environmental feminism, eco-conscious feminism, or ecofeminism, for instance, right? There'll be overlap there. And through those convergences, our movements will grow stronger and more united around our shared goals. And we're definitely seeing that with, feminists and queers for Palestine and some of those interventions that are being, put forward because I think feminists have a very, on the ground kind of orientation towards liberation, right?
Thank you so much. I've got so much to think with, and I come to this quite ignorant. You're talking so fast and with so many big concepts, I'm trying to make sense of it and contain it all in my head. I guess I had a question that was coming up for me in the first part of your talk, and then you kind of answered it. Because I see the title, which is Making Space for Indigenous Feminism, and I was thinking, where? And then you said it's mostly Canada. Mm-hmm. And so I was just curious, how global is this? You talk about the movement, and I know some of the names of the authors and know that they're Canadian. Yeah. Perhaps you've said some are from the United States. Is this how relevant would this be to say, Indigenous feminists in Pakistan, or I'm thinking about, we have students and colleagues from all over the world in sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely.
And the context is very Canadian. And so then partly I was sitting there thinking, should the colon be in Canada? Is this North America? Or what's your sense around this?
Yeah, okay, so it took a few iterations. It was more globally focused initially because we had contributions from Australia and New Zealand. It focuses on English settled states, right? So, but ultimately ended up after the sort of editorial shuffle that happens, and you get some drafts in, you don't get others in, right? It ended up being more focused on North America. However, a lot of the themes that I've continued to work on since submitting this, which, it just came out in the spring, but it was submitted long before that, I think, a pretty significant global relevance. I just took up some of these ideas, particularly ideas that are kind of confronting and challenging conceptions of the nation, conceptions of sovereignty, or even notions of relationality. So I've just written actually 2 pieces for international studies, like just short forum pieces. One on whether the question of sovereignty as non-interference is patriarchal, right? And that has application around different contexts, right? Whether articulations of sovereignty as non-interference or, the sort of turn to Indigenous relational practices of non-interference with the living earth, whether that has the potential to reproduce patriarchal notions and ideas in our politics, right? So that was one of them. The other was on, how to analyze Indigenous political orders generally. So it's for a global sort of IR forum as well, and talks about the need for feminist analyses, within this, again, sort of broader turn to relationality as a principle. And the reason why is because, of course, these questions are, incredibly gendered. These concepts are very gendered. And so I do think that there's probably, things that can be drawn out conceptually and brought across to other contexts, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you again. I echo my colleagues' gratitude for a wonderful, inspiring lecture presentation. I hope it makes sense what I'm going to say. So, and I echo Jude's point about lots of things to think about. So it's not an orderly drawn question. In the this department has published a few months ago a dedicated issue to Michael Marker, given that this lecture is in his memory, in which at least one of the contributions, but definitely also Michael Marker's interest, extended to so many areas, including areas that pertain to theology, to faith, and even to established religion. And one of the contributions was a direct engagement with the theology domain. So in your presentation, I like the fact how you outlined the different momentums that developed in the movement, and the manifestation, ecofeminism, etc. What kind of engagement has this movement that you've described engaged in the realm broadly defined as spirituality or organized religion? Yeah. And I'm saying this precisely over the backdrop of the effects of established Christian religions through residential schools, etc.
Absolutely, yeah.
Has there been anything that might be of interest with the intersection with this feminist conception of the movement?
Sure. Yeah. That's a really great question, and actually not one that I've given a lot of thought to, so my remarks will be just sort of off the cuff. I think there's definitely been Indigenous feminist sort of inquiries into the role of Christianity in advancing, notions of very defined and strict, narrow sort of notions of gender, but also of the family, of propriety, right? A lot of these sort of notions of what partnership, relationship, marriage, parenting should look like. And I think that's probably, in some of the chapters, I think where contributors are looking at the sort of social life of these questions, there would definitely be taking into account the ways in which, exposure to religion, Christian religion in residential schools specifically promoted and advanced the internalization of a lot of those notions of gender, right? Those notions of male supremacy and power and privilege over women. And we still see those, today in terms of what sorts of notions of identity were sort of internalized and then reproduced intergenerationally. So, a lot of Diane Million's work actually might be helpful there. She has a book called Therapeutic Nations, and she talks about, the sort of effects post-residential school where people largely fall into, alcoholism and addictions to deal with a lot of the abuse, right? And how the focus of our attention tends to be on violences like sexual abuse and then addictions within Indigenous communities, talking about and problematizing the sort of approach to healing that's required. But I think what you're asking about is something that is an area that's in need of greater elaboration and examination, definitely in terms of the sort of long-term impacts of residential schools, right? These aren't just things that can be healed in an instant. We have to go back far enough in time to be able to kind of excavate and then sort of affect intergenerational change moving forward for our children as well. but there's damage. There's still, not just in terms of people's sort of internalized gender ideas and embodiments, but there's also a lot of damage that's done to Indigenous spirituality across the board, right? To people's own understandings of their own cultures, traditions, and the relevance and importance today of those traditions. And so you'll see, within the resurgence movement, a lot of people talking about the need to return to our relationships with creation, our relationships with, let's say in the prairies, the buffalo, right? Because that actually is, the keystone of our spirituality. But for that, you need land, right? And so these analyses, they'll link together the need, for a spiritual resurgence, but also that's not something that can be talked about in a vacuum. This is something that requires a restoration of land and those relationships with creation, right? It wasn't just the theft of land, it was the theft of how, or the violence against our understandings of how we relate to the world around us, those intersubjective processes of coexisting and living well across difference, right? With other living beings, animals, newcomers that arrive at our shores. There has been violence done to all of that, right? But it all boils down to, and is related to the need to be able to reclaim those sort of relational, spiritual practices around how we constitute ourselves as living beings in relation to the world around us. And I think there's a lot of room for more to be said on that topic, but it's absolutely a very prominent part of what we're talking about, though I don't think it figures very centrally or, in a kind of paramount way in a lot of the literature.
So I have a question because I'm coming from Peru and there is a lot of work, happening in Avia Yala, which is a Kuna word for Latin America. Indigenous feminists, they are called communitarian feminists. And like, for example, Lorena Capnal in Guatemala and Julieta Paredes in Bolivia, who is Aymara. And they are talking a lot about, the defense of the land and the territory,
yes.
The cuerpo territory as a theory and as a praxis.
Yeah.
And they basically are centering the recreation of life,
yeah.
and the necessity of centering that. And at the same time, I remember Diane Million talking about here in a lecture at UBC that took place in 2021, if I'm incorrect. And in an unpublished paper, she talks about indigeneity as an ethos,
yeah.
and saying that indigeneity is more than an identity, but centers the recreation of life over death, and how can, disrupt the enclosure of the colonial capitalist infrastructure that try to enclose, indigenous bodies and their political orders. So I wonder about those resonances and the implications of the recreation of life, in thinking about indigeneity as an ethos in the context of a global crisis, ecological, social, ongoing genocide happening in Gaza, indigenous struggles, for example, in Peru, indigenous struggles led by indigenous women, in the context of extractivist mining in Guatemala, or here in Turtle Island. So I wonder just about your opinion about this, framing of the recreation of life over death and the implications of that in terms of thinking about indigenous feminisms and the contributions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, one of the central concerns for indigenous politics generally, but particularly often for women because of that association with creation, is, the advancement or the continuity of life for future generations, but also the conditions that we're working to bring forward for future generations, right? So it's not just a sort of, politics aren't just driven by, current or present needs. I mean, some people's are, but what I think a lot of feminists and women often point back to is the need to think of future generations, is the need to think of the sort of conditions that we're cultivating. What will those lives look like? How can we support the improvement of the conditions that those who are not yet born will enter into, right? So both for, current generations, absolutely, and our children, but, everything that I think Indigenous politics or resurgent Indigenous politics should be doing should be oriented towards Indigenous life and sovereignty, right? And part of what that means is, thinking deeply not just about our own needs as humans and how we might, move through conflict as human communities, but how we will attend to some of these crises with the living earth. And that's where we see a lot of feminist discourse being drawn on in terms of how to think through how to live well in non-hierarchical, non-dominating ways with the living earth. But those, yeah, I mean, I feel like the response is to affirm everything you said, because that is where we see women, taking, I think, leadership roles in a lot of different contexts of struggle, in a lot of contexts of crisis, and pointing back to the sort of generative power of relations in order to cultivate the conditions needed for us not just to survive, but to thrive into the future and to set up future generations to thrive.
Thank you.